Just your love and support is all I need.
Honey, you've got that. You've got that.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of good letters from people, just like people of support. So.
Oh, honey, you don't know how much support you had out here. So many people supported you. So many still support you. But this is what you want?
Yeah, this is my decision. This is what I'm gonna do. Now, this nightmare has to be over for everybody.
No. You have to remember, we're strong.
I know. This is my decision, though.
The prison phone line hums with static. It's late, the kind of hour where silence presses in heavy against concrete walls. A mother waits, clutching the receiver, searching for her son's voice in the emptiness of the call. Then it comes. Soft, quiet, almost flat. Mom, I just want this nightmare to end. Those 8 words slid out of Chris Watts like a sigh. To the world, they might sound like regret, like exhaustion, like the words of a man crushed under guilt. But if you listen closer, if you strip away the echo of sympathy, something darker surfaces. Chris Watts was not talking about Shanann, not about Bella, not about Celeste, and not about the unborn son whose life he ended before it even began. When Chris called his reality a nightmare, he wasn't acknowledging the horror he created. He was lamenting the one he was living through. The sentence, the cell, the shame. That's where our story begins. Not with the crime, not with the court case, not with August of 2018 that the world already knows. Our story begins with the words Chris Watts chose, because in the words of a killer lies the closest thing we ever get to the truth. Nightmare. It's a word that belongs to the innocent, not the guilty. It belongs to the victims who begged for life, not the man who stole it. And yet, killers like Chris cling to it. They reframe punishment as if it were tragedy. They twist justice into something cruel done to them, rather than something delivered for others. This is the deception of language. And Chris Watts was a master at it. Listen to the way he spoke after the murders. When cameras stood in his living room, he didn't say, "My wife has been murdered." He said, "My wife is missing." When he sat with investigators, he didn't say, "I ended their lives." He said, "Something happened." Always vague, always distanced, always soft enough to blur the edges of guilt. So when he told his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," he was still doing the same thing, shifting the frame, softening the edges, painting himself as a man trapped in a bad dream, rather than a murderer waking up to the weight of his actions. But here's the truth. Nightmares are temporary. They end when you wake up. Shanann didn't wake up. Bella didn't wake up. Celeste didn't wake up. For them, the nightmare was permanent. And that is why those 8 words, more than his interviews, more than his courtroom silence, more than even his written confessions, cut deeper. Because they reveal how Chris Watts thought of himself not as a monster, not even as a criminal, but as a victim of circumstance. As this story unfolds, we're not going to retell what you've already heard. You know the crime. You've seen the headlines. You've read the police files. What you haven't heard, what most documentaries never touch, is the way Chris's words expose him more than any piece of evidence. We're going to dissect that one phrase, pulling it apart word by word. We're going to place it under the harshest light and ask, what does it reveal about how he sees himself? What does it hide about the people he erased? And why do killers like him so often cast themselves as the ones suffering most? When the world first heard Chris Watts speak after the murders, people were struck by how calm he seemed. No tears, no frantic pleas, just flat, rehearsed words. That calmness wasn't silence, it was strategy. And this prison call to his mother, months later, carries the same DNA. He wasn't crying for forgiveness. He wasn't apologizing for Bella's final scream of "Daddy, no." He was centering himself. "Mom, I just want this nightmare to end. Not, I wish I could undo what I did." Not, I can't live knowing what I took from them. No, just the self-pity of a man whose cage became heavier than his conscience. As you listen tonight, I want you to remember this. Killers don't always reveal themselves in the courtroom. They reveal themselves in the quiet moments, in the words they don't think history will remember. Chris Watts believed that phone call was private, just a son talking to his mother. But words don't stay buried. They travel. They outlive. And sometimes, they tell a story sharper than any headline ever could. This is not a story about August 2018. This is a story about a single sentence that reveals the cold, hollow center of a man who destroyed his family. It's about a mother who listened and still called him my son. It's about language, psychology, and the chilling way killers twist truth until they look like victims. And by the end, when we circle back to that call, you'll hear his voice differently. Not as a man trapped in a nightmare, but as a man trying to rewrite it. If hearing those words already unsettles you, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, how many people like Chris Watts are walking free, speaking the same way, disguising guilt in soft words? If you don't want to be blind to them, subscribe now. Because ignoring these stories doesn't protect you, it only protects them. Words, they seem harmless. They seem weightless. But in the mouth of a murderer, words become weapons. They bend reality. They cover blood with a coat of paint so thin you can still see the stains underneath. Chris Watts understood this. Maybe not consciously, maybe not as a manipulative mastermind, but deep down, he knew words could soften the truth. And so he used them, over and over again. When Chris stood in front of cameras days after the murders, he didn't speak like a grieving husband. He spoke like a man giving a weather update. Flat voice, measured phrases. He said, I just want them to come back. If somebody has them, please bring them home. Listen closely. He didn't say, my wife and kids are in danger. He didn't say, I can't live without them. He said, I want them to come back. As if Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had simply wandered off. As if he were waiting for them to stroll through the front door, laughing, apologizing for the scare. It was self-pity disguised as concern. The focus wasn't on what they might be suffering. The focus was on what he was missing, his family unit, his normal routine, his image as a husband and father. This pattern stretches across every stage of his words. When he finally confessed, he didn't say, I murdered them. He said, I did something horrible. When he was confronted about his affair, he didn't say, I betrayed Shanann. He said, I fell out of love. Each phrase trims away the brutality, the betrayal, the humanity of his victims. Each phrase tucks the edges in neatly, packaging evil as if it were just a mistake. And then there was the phone call. Mom, I just want this nightmare to end. Think about the structure of that sentence. No subject, no action, no ownership. He didn't say, I created this nightmare. He didn't say, I ended lives, and I deserve this. He just placed himself in the middle of a foggy dream and begged for release. That's the essence of self-pity, language that erases accountability while demanding sympathy. Psychologists have a term for this, minimization. It's the way offenders downplay their crimes by choosing words that shrink their responsibility. Instead of saying, I beat her, they'll say, things got out of hand. Instead of, I murdered my children, they'll say, it just happened. Chris Watts fit this mold perfectly. His words show a man desperate not to sound monstrous. Desperate to sound like someone who snapped, instead of someone who planned, executed, and concealed. And he's not alone. Scott Peterson, who killed his pregnant wife Lacey, once said, things got really bad, and I didn't handle them well. Neil Entwistle, who murdered his wife and baby, called it a tragedy rather than a crime. Even family annihilator John List, who wiped out his entire household in the 1970s, described it as removing them from suffering instead of what it was, mass murder. This is the shared vocabulary of annihilators. They strip away verbs that point to themselves. They replace sharp, active language with soft, hazy words. They turn murder into a nightmare. They turn betrayal into falling out of love. They turn slaughter into a tragedy. Chris Watts lived inside that haze. His language was always passive, always distant, and always about him. Even in his prison letters, where he described the killings in chilling detail, he often circled back to his loneliness, to his new life, to his sense of being punished. Not once did he write about Bella's last words echoing in his ears. Not once did he describe the way Shanann fought for her life. Those voices weren't in his vocabulary. Only his own was. And that brings us back to why his words matter so much. Because self-pity in the mouth of a killer is more dangerous than silence. Silence admits nothing. But self-pity? Self-pity rewrites the story. Self-pity turns murderers into victims and erases the people they killed. When Chris Watts told his mother he wanted the nightmare to end, he wasn't telling her the truth. He was selling her a version of himself she could still believe in. The boy she raised, the man she could pity, the son who wasn't beyond saving. And in that moment, Cindy Watts didn't hear the monster. She heard her child. That's what self-pity does. It manipulates not only the speaker, but the listener too. If you've ever listened to someone twist words until you almost doubted yourself, you know how dangerous language can be. Mothers are not built to imagine their children as killers. They picture scraped knees, not bloodied hands. Report cards, not arrest records. They remember the first cries in a hospital room, not the final screams in a darkened bedroom. And so, when Chris Watts told his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," Cindy Watts did what many mothers do when the world turns against their sons. She listened. She comforted. She absorbed his words, not as the world heard them, but as only a mother could. Cindy had always seen Chris as the quiet one, the shy boy, the son who never raised his voice, who kept to himself, who avoided trouble. To her, he was predictable, steady, almost fragile. She admitted in interviews that she never believed Shanann was right for him, never believed he was truly happy in the marriage. In Cindy's eyes, Chris wasn't a man who would snap. He was a man who could be pushed too far. That framing mattered. Because when he told her his life in prison was a nightmare, she didn't hear self-pity. She heard suffering. She heard the voice of the child she still wanted to protect. When the news first broke in 2018, Cindy Watts was stunned, but her shock quickly turned to defense. In interviews, she questioned Shanann's role in the marriage. She spoke of her son's character. She painted him as someone who couldn't possibly commit such violence without provocation. And when Chris himself fed her vague phrases, when he leaned on the softness of words like nightmare, she took them in as proof of his humanity. If he was suffering, then maybe he wasn't a monster. If he was trapped in a nightmare, maybe he was still the boy she raised. This is what self-pity feeds on, a willing listener. Chris Watts needed an audience for his reframing, and his mother gave him one. Not because she was blind, not because she condoned his crimes, but because she couldn't sever the bond between mother and child, even when that child annihilated his own family. Think about that prison call again. Chris didn't cry out to the investigators. He didn't say it to the press. He said it to his mother, because he knew she would cradle those words, not challenge them. He knew that in her ears, nightmare didn't mean manipulation, it meant pain. But there's something deeply unsettling here. Because every moment a killer's words are comforted, the victims are erased a little more. Every time Cindy said, "He's my son," Shanann's voice was pushed further into silence. Every time she nodded through his self-pity, Bella and Celeste's last cries became quieter. That doesn't make Cindy Watts evil. It makes her human. Mothers are designed to protect their children, even when the rest of the world turns away. But in doing so, Cindy became a mirror that reflected back to Chris only what he wanted to see, himself as the one suffering most. Other killers have had mothers just like Cindy. Ted Bundy's mother insisted until the end that her son was incapable of murder. Jeffrey Dahmer's father described him as a victim of his own mind. Even Scott Peterson's family defended his character long after conviction. There's a pattern here. The mother's love, when twisted by a son's crime, becomes a shield. A fragile, desperate shield. And in Chris's case, it allowed him to keep using words like nightmare without being forced to face what that word erased. But there's another layer. Cindy Watts herself used words that mirrored Chris's self-pity. In interviews, she said she believed Shanann was controlling. She questioned whether her son had ever been truly happy. She described Chris as a loving father who lost himself. Her words softened his crime, just as it softened his guilt. Together, mother and son built a vocabulary where murder became a mistake, where annihilation became a nightmare. And in that shared language, the victims were buried a second time, not just under the dirt of an oil field, but under the weight of words that never spoke their names. This is why the role of Cindy Watts matters. Because she reveals how killers keep their narratives alive. They find the one person who can't let go, the one person who will take their words at face value. And in that relationship, the killer's version of events, no matter how warped, lives on. Chris Watts knew his mother loved him unconditionally, and so he gave her words that sounded like vulnerability. He gave her nightmare instead of crime. He gave her suffering instead of responsibility. And she, like any mother, held on to them. But as we move deeper into this story, we have to ask, what happens when love blinds us to truth? What happens when a mother's comfort becomes a murderer's shield? And how many times have victims been erased not by silence, but by the language that mothers accept from their guilty sons? The cell door clanged shut, and for the first time, Chris Watts was surrounded by silence he couldn't escape. No children's laughter, no Shanann's voice, no television hum from a suburban living room. Just concrete, steel, and the endless ticking of time. To most, prison is punishment. To Chris, it became the nightmare he whispered about. But what does prison look like for a man who destroyed his entire family? And why did he frame this as the unbearable part of his story, rather than the crimes themselves? At Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Chris Watts lives a life stripped of choice. He wakes at dawn to the sound of heavy doors unlocking, the rattle of keys echoing down the tiers. Breakfast is not eggs made by Shanann, not the family meals he once took for granted, but trays of lukewarm food passed through steel slots. He spends his days in a small cell, concrete walls, a narrow bed, a stainless steel sink bolted to the corner. His companions are not his children, but the muffled voices of other inmates, some shouting, some crying, some laughing at things he'll never be part of. Every hour is monitored. Every movement is scheduled. Privacy does not exist. And yet, Chris describes this as the nightmare. He has told pen pals that his days blur together, that prison feels like being frozen in time. He has written about his isolation, about how he is recognized by other inmates as the man who murdered his children. He eats alone. He prays alone. He lives with the knowledge that, to many, he is the lowest of the low, even among killers. But listen to how he frames it. In his letters, he doesn't write about the memory of Shanann's fear. He doesn't write about Bella crying, "Daddy, no." He writes about his loneliness, his boredom, his shame. The nightmare, in Chris Watts' words, is not what he did, it's what he lost. His freedom, his comforts, his image as a family man. This is where his language betrays him again. Because for men like Chris, prison is not just a cage. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, he sees not the faces of his victims, but his own reflection. Inmates who have shared space with him describe a man who keeps his head down, avoids conflict, and spends long hours reading the Bible. He clings to Scripture, perhaps to quiet his conscience, perhaps to rewrite himself as a man of faith. But even in those words, even in prayer, his focus drifts back to himself, his salvation, his redemption, his peace. Never theirs. The nightmare he complains of is filled with ordinary prison routines. Lights on at 6 a.m., Count times when every inmate must stand in silence. Days broken by meals, brief recreation, and the monotony of locked doors. Nights where the weight of silence presses down heavier than the walls. But the real nightmare, the one Chris Watts avoids naming, is what plays behind his eyelids when he closes his eyes. Because even in letters where he avoids the truth, fragments slip out. He admits Bella's last words haunt him. He admits Shanann's struggle replays in his head. He admits Celeste's innocence cuts deepest. And yet, even here, he frames it as his suffering. The haunting is not their tragedy. It is his punishment. That's the distortion of Chris Watts' nightmare. It is not about empathy. It is not about remorse. It is about the discomfort of being forced to face himself without escape. In one phone call, he told his family that prison feels like living in a fog. Another time, he described it as being stuck in a dream you can't wake up from. The irony is staggering, because that's exactly what he created for his daughters in their final moments, a nightmare they couldn't escape. But there's another layer. Chris is not just any inmate. His notoriety makes him a target. Other prisoners despise family killers. To many inside, murdering a spouse is one thing, but murdering children? That puts you at the very bottom of the hierarchy. And so, Chris is kept under close watch, often in protective housing. He lives with the knowledge that violence could reach him at any moment. He avoids eye contact. He avoids conversations. He writes instead. He prays instead. And always, he frames it as his nightmare. But prison is not the nightmare. Prison is justice. The nightmare was Shanann gasping for air under the hands of the man she trusted most. The nightmare was Bella's tiny voice, crying, begging, still believing her daddy could love her. The nightmare was Celeste's confusion as she watched her sister die and knew she was next. Those were nightmares that never ended. Chris Watts, in his cell, gets to close his eyes each night and wake up the next morning. Shanann and her children do not. That is the difference. That is the truth. And so, when he tells his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," what he really means is, "I want my punishment to end. I want my discomfort to end. I want the reflection in this prison mirror to go away." It is not remorse. It is not regret. It is self-pity disguised as suffering. Prison walls do something to the human voice. They make it echo, stretch, distort. For Chris Watts, who no longer had cameras in his living room or neighbors to convince, his voice found another outlet: letters. From behind bars, Chris began writing to strangers, pen pals, and true crime enthusiasts who reached out. He filled page after page in small, careful handwriting. At first glance, they read like the words of a man coming to terms with his crimes. But if you listen closely, if you tune your ear to the patterns, you'll hear the same melody as in that phone call to his mother. The melody of self-pity. In one letter, Chris described the murders. He admitted he strangled Shanann. He admitted he smothered Bella and Celeste. He admitted he placed their bodies in oil tanks. But notice the way he framed it. He didn't write, "I killed them." He wrote, "I didn't want to do this, but I felt like it was the only way." Again, the shift. Not murder, but compulsion. Not choice, but circumstance. As though the violence wasn't an act of his own will, but something forced upon him, like rain falling or wind blowing. In another letter, he spoke of Bella's last words, "Daddy, no." He admitted those words still echo in his head. But instead of centering Bella's terror, he wrote about the way it haunts him. How those words make him suffer. How they keep him awake at night. He turned his daughter's final cry into his own punishment. Once again, the pain of his victims was repackaged as his own nightmare. This is the pattern we see over and over again. Even in confession, Chris sought to soften, to blur, to shift the focus. When investigators asked him why, he said, "I just thought it would be easier if they weren't here." Easier. That was his word for annihilating his family. Not monstrous. Not brutal. Easier. As if their lives were just weight on his shoulders, and by removing them, he lightened his load. In psychology, This is called cognitive reframing. It's the way people adjust their language to make their actions bearable to themselves. Killers like Chris don't often say, "I murdered." They say, "It happened." They don't say, "I destroyed." They say, "I lost control." This language isn't just slippery, it's dangerous. Because when killers send letters, when they share confessions, those words become history. They enter documentaries, podcasts, books. And if we don't challenge them, the killers get to write their own narratives. Chris's letters reveal another disturbing thread: his obsession with being understood. He wrote about wanting to be forgiven. He wrote about God giving him peace. He wrote about hoping people would see him as more than a monster. In his words, he wasn't seeking justice. He was seeking an audience. He was trying to script his legacy from inside his cell. Even his use of scripture bent toward himself. He quoted passages about forgiveness, about redemption, about grace. Rarely did he cite verses about judgment, accountability, or the innocent. His Bible was a mirror, not a window. And this brings us back to the phone call. When Chris told his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," it wasn't just a plea for relief. It was part of a longer pattern, a pattern where every word he chose, whether in letters, interviews, or confessions, was designed to soften the truth. His nightmare was not the murders. His nightmare was the mirror he could not escape in prison. But we cannot let his words stand unchallenged. Because Shanann never got to write letters explaining her side. Bella never got to tell the world about her last cry. Celeste never got to say how afraid she was. And baby Nico never got to take his first breath. Chris's words exist because theirs were silenced. That is the cruel imbalance of crimes like this. The killer goes on speaking, while the victims are erased. Nightmare. It's a word most of us know from childhood. Waking in the dark, breathless, heart racing, crying for comfort. And in the morning, the terror fades. Because nightmares, by nature, end when you wake up. But when Chris Watts told his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," he wasn't describing a bad dream. He was describing reality. His reality. And that choice of word tells us everything about how he saw himself. Nightmares are passive. They happen to us. We don't choose them. We don't control them. We're trapped inside them. By calling his prison sentence a nightmare, Chris removed himself from the role of active agent. He wasn't the architect of horror. He was the victim of one. He didn't murder his family. He was living in a nightmare. It's the same mental sleight of hand he used throughout his words, turning crimes into accidents, turning choices into inevitabilities, turning murder into dreams. Psychologists call this linguistic distancing. It's when people use language that separates them from their actions. Instead of saying, "I killed my wife," they say, "Something happened." Instead of, "I strangled her," they say, "Things got out of control." It's a way of protecting the self from the full weight of guilt. And for Chris Watts, calling it a nightmare allowed him to inhabit his prison sentence as if it were something thrust upon him, not something he earned through annihilation. But nightmares also carry another layer. They invite sympathy. When someone says, "I'm living in a nightmare," our instinct is to comfort them, to tell them it will be okay, to remind them that nightmares end. Chris knew this. He said it not to detectives, not to reporters, but to his mother. The one person guaranteed to interpret it as suffering, not manipulation. In that single word, he secured her comfort. He secured her defense. He secured her belief that, beneath it all, he was still her little boy lost in a bad dream. Yet there's a brutal irony here. Because while Chris described his prison as a nightmare, the real nightmares belonged to the people who no longer had voices. For Shanann, the nightmare was realizing the man she built a life with, the man she defended even when her friends questioned him, was the one tightening his hands around her throat. For Bella, the nightmare was watching her sister die and knowing she was next. For Celeste, the nightmare was her last question, whispered in the dark. Is the same thing going to happen to me? Those were nightmares without waking. Other killers have used the same dreamlike language. John List, who murdered his wife, mother, and children in 1971, called it relieving them of suffering, as if he were trapped in fate. Scott Peterson referred to the murder of Lacey as a tragedy that happened, never once naming himself as the cause. Even Ted Bundy, on the eve of his execution, spoke of his killings as if he were possessed by something dark, removing himself from agency. It's a pattern. Annihilators and manipulators wrap their violence in the language of dreams, fate, or nightmares. Why? Because it lets them rewrite their roles, from perpetrators into passengers. But here's the truth Chris Watts could never say. His nightmare has an ending. Every night in his cell, when the lights go out, he gets to close his eyes. He gets to wake up to a new day. Shanann doesn't. Bella doesn't. Celeste doesn't. Nico doesn't. Their nightmares were final. His continues only because he still has the privilege of breath. And this is where the psychology becomes chilling. Because when Chris says, "I want this nightmare to end," what he really wants is escape. Escape from guilt. Escape from memory. Escape from the mirror in his cell. But escape is not justice. And escape is not remorse. Nightmares, for most of us, end when we wake up. For Chris Watts, there is no waking up. There is only the slow, endless replay of the truth he refuses to face. When Chris Watts told his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," he was speaking of his prison life. But the truth is, the nightmare began long before those cell doors closed. For Shanann, the nightmare was not a sudden moment. It was a drip. Slow. Relentless. Like water wearing down stone. She had built her life around him. She defended him when others questioned his coldness. She posted smiling family portraits online, each caption carefully written, as if words could hold together what she was afraid might be falling apart. But in private, Shanann lived with a silence that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Chris withdrew. He stopped texting back. He pulled away when she reached for him. She told her friends she felt like she was chasing a ghost. She asked him directly, "Do you still love me?" And his answers, when they came at all, were hollow. This was her nightmare. The man she married becoming a stranger before her eyes. Gaslighting is a cruel form of torture. It doesn't break bones. It breaks certainty. Shanann sent message after message, asking what was wrong, asking why he felt so distant. His replies gave her nothing. Short sentences, vague reassurances. He told her he was tired. He told her it was stress. He told her it was nothing. But Shanann felt the truth pressing in. She felt it in the way his eyes didn't linger anymore. She felt it in the way he avoided her touch. She felt it in the silence between them that grew louder than words. That silence was the nightmare. Because silence tells you everything while pretending to tell you nothing. Behind her strong exterior, Shanann was carrying the weight of doubt, of blame, of fear that she was somehow the problem. She even told her friends she worried she was too demanding, too controlling. But the truth was simpler. Chris had already left the marriage emotionally. He just hadn't left physically. And that gap, that space where love used to live, was where Shanann's nightmare unfolded every single day. The betrayal wasn't only in his actions. It was in his performance. Chris smiled for photos. He played with the girls. He let Shanann believe they were still a family. And yet, in secret, he was building another life, another relationship, another identity. Imagine the disorientation. Sleeping next to someone every night, while suspecting their heart is already elsewhere. Cooking meals, tucking in children, making plans for the future, while your partner hides texts, lies about late nights, and avoids your eyes. That is the nightmare of emotional abandonment. It's invisible to the outside world, but suffocating to the one living inside it. Shanann's last texts capture the raw truth of her nightmare. She wrote things like, "I don't know how you fell out of love with me. I feel like I'm not good enough. I don't know what's going on with you anymore." Each message was a plea, a cry in the dark for a man who had already decided to walk away, not by leaving her, but by erasing her. And when Chris finally called his prison life a nightmare, the irony was unbearable, because Shanann had already been living in one, and hers didn't come with a cell, or guards, or locked doors. Hers came with the quiet cruelty of being unloved by the man she loved most. Nightmares don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the person you share a bed with. Sometimes they look like silence at the dinner table. Sometimes they look like a smile in public and indifference in private. For Shanann, the nightmare wasn't only how her life ended. It was how her life with Chris hollowed out before it did. And that's the difference between their words. Chris said, "I just want this nightmare to end." But Shanann lived her nightmare every day, one text at a time, one unanswered question at a time, one betrayal at a time. Her nightmare wasn't the prison walls. It was the house she called home. When Chris Watts whispered to his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," he was speaking from a prison cell. But the children who called him Daddy never got to speak at all. Their voices were cut short, their words unfinished, their innocence betrayed. And yet, their silence speaks louder than anything Chris ever said. Bella was only 4 years old enough to know her father's face, old enough to believe he was her protector, but still young enough to carry the wide-eyed trust of a child who sees her dad as invincible. Her world was small: bedtime stories, her mother's laughter, the comfort of her sister beside her. And in that small world, her father was the center. Celeste was 3, bright, playful, mischievous. She copied her big sister's every move. She clung to her daddy's legs, looked up at him with a smile that carried no doubt, no suspicion, no fear, at least not until the very end. They were not just children. They were the embodiment of unconditional love. They gave it freely. They expected it back without question. And this is where Chris's words become so grotesque. He said his prison life was a nightmare. But what word could ever describe the nightmare he forced onto Bella and Celeste? For Bella, the nightmare was watching her father's face twist into something unrecognizable. The same lips that kissed her forehead turned against her. The same hands that once carried her in safety became the instruments of her fear. Her last words, "Daddy, no," were not just a plea. They were the shattering of a child's belief that love protects. For Celeste, the nightmare was confusion. She asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me?" That question carries a weight no child should ever bear. It was the recognition of danger in the one place she should have been safest. Chris Watts has described his prison life as a fog, a bad dream he cannot wake from. But what he never says is that he created something far darker. He turned his daughter's final moments into waking nightmares. Nightmares that didn't end with a jolt awake in bed. Nightmares that ended with silence. There's another cruel layer here. Children don't just trust their parents. They become their parents in memory. The words Chris left behind, the letters, the confessions, the phone calls, outlived Bella and Celeste's voices. He still gets to speak. They do not. Every time he tells his mother about his nightmare, he rewrites history in his own voice, while theirs stays frozen in time. The last words of his daughters will never change. His, meanwhile, go on echoing in prison calls and written pages. That imbalance is the deepest insult of all. Innocence carries a kind of weight killers can't touch. That's why hearing Bella's last words breaks people to this day. That's why imagining Celeste's final question chills us. Because we know children should never have to beg their father for mercy. Their voices, though silenced, remain the truest part of this story. They cut through every excuse, every softened word, every self-pitying phrase Chris ever used. When he said, "I want this nightmare to end," we must remember, his daughters said nothing of nightmares. They were living them. And unlike him, they didn't wake up. The psychology of betrayal here is staggering. Children are biologically wired to trust their parents, to run into their arms when they're scared, to believe, without question, that mom and dad are safe. When that trust is broken, it isn't just a crime, it's a cosmic violation. Chris Watts shattered that bond in the most brutal way possible. And yet, in his words from prison, he never acknowledged it. He never said, "I destroyed their trust." He never said, "I betrayed them." Instead, he retreated to himself, his fog, his dream, his nightmare. But Bella and Celeste still speak in their absence. Their voices echo every time someone challenges Chris's language. Their memory screams every time he softens the truth. Their innocence becomes the sharpest indictment against his self-pity. History remembers killers by their actions, but the world obsesses over their words. And sometimes, those words haunt us longer than the crime itself. When Chris Watts whispered to his mother, "I just want this nightmare to end," he gave us a phrase that now floats above every documentary, every podcast, every discussion about him. It is the sentence that crystallized his self-pity. It is the line that revealed his heart, or rather, the absence of one. Words have always been central to this case. From the moment Chris spoke on camera in front of his house, to the letters he scribbled from prison, to the phone calls with his mother, his language became the second crime scene. Every phrase was evidence. Every word was a fingerprint of his psychology. And just like blood stains, words linger. They embed themselves in memory. The public remembers Shanann's bright videos, her hopeful captions, her posts about family. Those were her words. But when her life was cut short, her words stopped. They froze in time. Chris's, however, went on. He spoke to reporters. He spoke to detectives. He spoke to his family. He wrote letters. He prayed out loud. He confessed. And each time, he framed his world with the same recurring tone, vague, soft, self-centered. And so now, when people talk about Chris Watts, they repeat not just the facts of his crimes, but the lines he left behind. "I just want them to come back. Things just happened. I just want this nightmare to end." His words echo, and that is part of the horror. Because killers know something instinctively. Language shapes legacy. Scott Peterson's calm TV interviews still surface today. Ted Bundy's final words are quoted more than the details of his killings. Even Charles Manson, with his bizarre rants, built a mythology out of words. Chris Watts may not be charismatic, but his soft, pitiful phrases achieve the same effect. They stick. They spread. They give people something to analyze, to argue over, to replay. And in doing so, they risk overshadowing the silence of the victims. But there's another reason his words haunt us. Because they expose the gap between what we expect killers to say and what they actually do. We expect apologies. We expect cries of guilt. We expect some recognition of the humanity they erased. Instead, Chris gave us nightmare. A word that placed him, not Shanann or Bella or Celeste, at the center of the tragedy. A word that invited sympathy instead of condemnation. A word that framed him as trapped, not as the trapper. That is why his words endure. They are wrong in all the ways that reveal who he really was. The legacy of words is dangerous. Because language shapes public memory, and public memory shapes justice. If we repeat Chris's self-pitying phrases without challenge, they gain weight. They soften him in the eyes of those willing to be deceived. They transform him from a family annihilator into a broken man living a nightmare. That is why true crime storytelling must dismantle these words. It is why we return to them, again and again, pulling them apart until their illusions collapse. Chris Watts left behind many words, but Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico cannot. Their words stopped the moment he chose to silence them. That is the imbalance at the heart of all annihilation cases. The killer speaks on, the victims do not. So what do? We refuse to let his words stand as the final story. We amplify theirs, their videos, their laughter, their texts, their innocence, until his excuses are drowned out. That is the legacy of words, not the ones Chris used to shield himself, but the ones we choose to remember, repeat, and defend. The prison line goes quiet. The words already spoken hang heavy. caught between the walls of Dodge Correctional Institution and the ears of a mother who still cannot reconcile her son with his crimes. Mom, I just want this nightmare to end. It is a phrase that has echoed through every corner of this story. It is the sentence that stripped Chris Watts bare, not in his actions, but in his language. Because in those 8 words, he revealed the hollow center of his soul. The nightmare he spoke of was his own. The long days in prison, the stares of other inmates, the endless replay of what he did, circling his mind like a vulture. To Chris, that was the nightmare. But his nightmare was survivable. His nightmare came with 3 meals a day, a Bible on his shelf, and the privilege of waking up every morning with breath in his lungs. Shanann's nightmare did not end. Bella's nightmare did not end. Celeste's nightmare did not end. Nico's never had the chance to begin. That is the chasm between his words and their truth. Shanann's nightmare was the slow unraveling of love. A husband who withdrew, who grew colder with every passing day, who made her question her worth even as she carried his child. Her nightmare was the silence, the unanswered questions, the realization that the man she defended was erasing her from his heart long before he erased her from life. Bella's nightmare was looking into her father's eyes and realizing they no longer carried safety. Her final words, "Daddy, no," were the breaking of innocence, the shattering of trust. Celeste's nightmare was that whispered question, "Is the same thing going to happen to me?" A child recognizing danger not in a stranger, but in her own blood. These were the real nightmares. They did not come with prison doors. They did not end with sleep. They ended only with silence. And so, when Chris Watts asked for his nightmare to end, what he was really asking was to be free of consequence, to be free of mirrors, to be free of himself. But nightmares are not meant to comfort the guilty. They are the bare minimum of justice for the innocent who cannot speak anymore. History will remember Chris Watts not only for what he did, but for what he said. His words will haunt us because they are so wrong, so inverted, so selfish, that they shine a light on who he truly was. Not a man broken by guilt, not a father consumed with sorrow, but a killer who mourned only his own suffering. And here is where we leave you, with a choice. Do you let his words linger unchallenged, repeating them until they bury Shanann's, Bella's, Celeste's, and Nico's voices? Or do you take them apart, expose them for what they are, and replace them with the truth? Chris Watts wanted his nightmare to end. But for Shanann and her children, the nightmare was final. The only ending they ever got was silence. We cannot change that. But we can choose who speaks louder in history. The man who complained of prison, or the family he erased.